This is normally where I'd make a joke about not being sleepy or something, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm sure that our distinguished panelists will keep you on the edge of your seats for this next topic. So they all come from a different variety of backgrounds, we all do. Thankfully, I'm the only lawyer, so lucky for them and lucky for you. But we hope that this will be a sort of practical session from your perspectives. And with that in mind, it would be really great if maybe each of you could discuss how do you interact with regulatory issues in your role, and how is it important in the context of your business? Maybe we'll start with Emma.
Thanks, David. So I'm Emma, co-founder of IMUNIS, alongside Dr. Lucy Lord, who is a prominent doctor in Hong Kong. IMUNIS is a digital health platform that aims to digitize the whole life course journey of vaccination. And in doing so, we bring together health records, vaccine health records, and digitize all of the global recommendations from around the world as to which vaccines are recommended to be taken when, which obviously vary by jurisdiction. And we bring those two together with a view to giving a patient a personalized status and prompts along the way so that they hopefully are aware of which vaccines to take when and when those change. And we also have an API which we provide to health companies such as FWD, so they can provide interactive journeys, digital journeys for their users. And so we obviously interact with regulation from a data privacy point of view. We touch healthcare records, we touch electronic health record systems, personal data. We aren't currently regulated as a medical device, or certainly in Hong Kong, we're not regulated as a medical device. We do guide doctors. The vaccination process is quite administrative, and we do prompt doctors to look at their audiences and know who is vaxxed, who isn't vaxxed, so that they can work with them proactively. And we use official guidelines to do that, so that is going to be subject to regulation. I think it was interesting this morning listening to the AIA view, where they talked about having a proof of your effectiveness. And even though we're not regulated, and that medical device regulation would usually take you down that path, it's something we're very, very careful to do because trust is critical, and we need to know that we're having the right outcomes with our solutions.
I built a company called Galen Growth about 9 years ago. It's basically a market intelligence company for digital health only. So we literally only focus on digital health, no medtech unless there's a digital component to that. We don't necessarily work ourselves in the regulatory framework side, but we are advising lots of governments on how do they implement the best strategy. And this can be either for software as a medical device, it can be for data privacy as well, it can be anything around the regulatory side of how you use health data. Yeah, I basically make it quite short.
Thanks. The question is, how do I interact with regulations? In 3 ways. The first one is that I'm a CEO of a digital health company called Angsana. It's based in Malaysia, covering Southeast Asia. Number 2, I'm a researcher in global health for several think tanks and universities. And thirdly, advisor to the Malaysian Health Ministry in terms of health systems reform, which has a lot of regulations about digital health and health technologies as well. Back to you.
Very good, on time, well done. Well, I think that's very helpful to set up the next question, because with that context in mind, what challenges do you face in light of the current sort of regulatory landscape? Let's start with you, Dario.
Okay, when we look into the regulatory framework globally, generally there are so many different guidelines that we need to follow depending on which ecosystem you are in. We look into Europe, almost every country has their own regulatory framework, even when you are within the European Union, even though they're currently trying to harmonize that as well. There's been about 2 years ago now a discussion around the Harmonization Act across Europe, and they're trying to basically help you also to send data cross-border within the European Union. The same as in the US. There's also a Harmonization Act that is currently, I think, in the 3rd phase of reiteration, and they're trying to publish that next year, also to make the cross-border data transfer between states in the US a bit more efficient. We move this a bit more towards an Asia context, considering that I'm also based in Singapore. There doesn't really exist anything in that sense yet. ASEAN has been trying to work on different ways of how you structure data in a very similar way, and therefore making data more accessible across the ecosystems as well, but there is no real act or guideline yet so far in place. that would allow that. Northeast Asia is also very different as well, considering that between Japan and Korea, for instance, there's also no interaction. So what we see happening in the European Union and in North America, where even between Canada and the US, there are certain acts of how data can be transferred, does not exist in Asia whatsoever yet. And there is the way, or there's the need that we need to see that change in the near future as well.
SK, do you want to add?
Thanks. Dario talked a lot about regulations of data, which is a great point. Let me add maybe 4 more challenges of regulations. But when you use the word challenges, it's actually the flip side of opportunity, meaning these are opportunities for industry players, scholars, researchers, clinicians to participate in the decision-making process and policy-making process and regulation-making process together with government. So challenges are great, but they're also an opportunity. Here are 4 more opportunities. The first one is the move from premise-based licensing to service-based licensing. Here's what I mean. Traditional health technologies regulations regulates the premises, meaning the physical premises. Example, regulates the clinics and gives a license to hospitals and clinics and ambulatory care centers. But for data, Emma's and Dario's work and perhaps even a lot of my work, it's services-based, which means that it's delivered on the cloud, over the internet. So how do you regulate away from a physical premise to a service that's virtual and in the cloud? That's opportunity number 1. Opportunity number 2 is to talk about how the traditional technologies have been regulated, which starts with assessment tools. To assess whether or not a drug or a medical device should be approved in a particular country, lots of people have tools for that. Pharmacists have tools, economists have tools, clinicians have tools to assess quality, safety, and affordability of medicines and devices. But we don't have similar parallels for digital tools or digital health or other emerging health technologies. That's the second opportunity, which means new tools to assess the quality, safety, and cost effectiveness, meaning affordability of digital tools. The third one of opportunity is really interactions with other regulations. In emerging technologies in healthcare, it's not just regulations of healthcare products, but how does healthcare regulations intersect with regulations for telecommunications, artificial intelligence, technology writ large, and all those regulations are outside of the Ministry of Health, and that's the third opportunity. And the fourth and final opportunity is to assess ways to combine regulations with reimbursement, and there's a whole speech over there as well, probably requiring a second conference, and I'm going to leave Brinc to organize that. David.
Yeah, well, with that, we'll finish with Emma on this.
I do have another point. I would say mirror all of those points, but an additional one is probably around interoperability. We talked about it again a little bit this morning, but if we think about patient centricity, we all hear and we all experience all the time the desire to have all of our patient records accessible in one place, and importantly, to be able to interpret them in some way. And that's still, quite a big challenge all over the world right now. We're seeing in the US some sways towards enforcement of electronic medical record systems that have to enable data transfer. We're seeing a bit of a move in that in the UK and Europe as well. We have some systems that do it in Asia, but generally speaking, it's not enforced. And therefore, that presents challenges and opportunities, to SK's point. I would say from our point of view, we want to be able to merge records. We're really trying to Marie Kondo the vaccine record, if you like, and bring it all together, clean it up, and make it lovely and accessible and something you enjoy looking at and can work with. And it's a huge task to just bring the records together. And I think the important part is it's not just about tech and privacy, but it's about incentives. Most of the entities that have and control that data today are not incentivized in any way to release it to the patient or to any other provider. And I think if we did have that, we would see a real rise in the number of innovative solutions that can layer over the top of that joined up data to make sense of the data for the patient, for the doctor, all of which would potentially radically speed things up. So I personally would love to see more done in that space.
Can I add to that?
Of course, yeah.
To probably add to the point, also the problem is that currently everyone kind of says that I own your data. When you go to a hospital, it's the hospital that says it's my data. But then the government sits on top of the hospital and says, no, that's actually our data. So The problem is that the patient is probably the least person to know that they actually own the data, considering it's still their physics, it's their data, which they're also currently not incentivized to even ask for that. So you do need to change that mindset behind that, which is the most tricky point at the moment.
Well, I think we're seeing an interesting trend, apart from, it's good to see that there are opportunities arising out of these, but also a lot developing in terms of some kind of, the interoperability piece, the idea of some conformity going through and throughout the region, because otherwise it ends up being very difficult. And so that, I think that again goes into the sort of practical side we're looking for here. And so in your perspectives, how do you think that the regulation needs to change, how it can improve for health technology, perhaps with example of how it works in your area? Let's go SK.
Thank you, David. How can we improve regulations, right? So can I share 3 thoughts? The first one is a mindset, and then 2 specific suggestions. The mindset is that regulations are our friends. For the entrepreneur, regulations should not choke us, but rather, if done correctly, regulations can be smart, can be enabling, and they could be our friends. To do means regulations, and regulators especially. To do that, obviously, we'll need some solutions. So maybe I'll share 2 thoughts. The first one is to say that there should be sandboxes. And if sandboxes don't exist, either a sandbox for data, a sandbox for privacy, a sandbox for interoperability, whatever, just figure out the sandbox that you think is necessary for your particular sector and ask for a sandbox to be created with the regulator. Sometimes 2 regulators need to come together. Example, the central bank or the insurance authorities probably needs to talk to the health authorities in order to have a sandbox for fintech for health or insurtech for health. But the point is, have a sandbox where one doesn't exist, create one. The second one, second tip really for all of us in this room is something called manufactured consensus. It sounds a little weird, but what governments generally struggle to do is when there are multiple stakeholders in the industry. So industry stakeholders, and there's researchers and clinicians and patient groups and all the other stakeholders out there. But if all the stakeholders can form a coalition or an alliance of sorts and manufacture a certain sense of consensus, it's easier for the government to interact with this group of people who are not part of the government. And that way, it's another easy way for us to have smart regulations. So how do you have smarter regulations? Have a sandbox first and then make it a formal regulation. And number 2, try to manufacture consensus wherever possible. Thank you.
Emma, we'll move on to you.
Really like it, and I guess maybe that's under the umbrella SK of regulate to innovate. So I quite like that idea that we obviously need and should value regulation. It's there for good reason, but it does impede innovation when A, it has a cost with it, and B, it has an additional cost if it's inconsistent or in a stage of maturity and therefore evolving over time. So I'd agree with all of that. I think there's some good examples coming. We also work in the UK, so not necessarily a sandbox, but there's an interesting example of something called the Change Programme in the UK, where they're bringing together regulations under the MHRA and NICE, so 2 entities that currently or previously regulate separately have come together and very explicitly looked at where are we duplicating what we're asking companies to do. Okay, let's ask one time. Where can we make this streamline? Obviously, there'll be some places where there's divergence because solutions are different, but the point is they've done it with speed and innovation in mind and reducing cost. So I think there's, there are examples of it around the world, and it would just be great to see more of that applied globally.
Let me probably give one negative point on that. Generally, when you speak about governments, they often change. Like generally, like a cycle is 4 to 5 years, depending on which country you are in. Speaking from the past, I worked with a Southeast Asian country that wanted to integrate a new software as a medical device regulatory framework by focusing on different ecosystems globally and basically looking into how can we adapt this into our own ecosystem. Now the problem was, so we finished the entire work. It took us like 9 months, and after this there was a voting cycle. So actually the entire government changed. So by trying to continue on the work, they basically said, let's just reshuffle everything. We don't want to do that anymore. It's not what we are focused on at the moment. So literally, you've been working with the government for about 1.5 years. Project took 9 months. You went forward into actually integrating it, and now within a day, everything changes. And this is always the trouble that innovators are also the most struggling with, because You need to work in an ecosystem that is ever changing, sometimes just rolling backwards, while you actually think, we make a change. You can make as much change as you want if the government that sits on top of that is not willing to change anything into your favor. Probably a negative point.
I think Dario raises a very real world problem. So let me try to provide a partial solution to this. Politicians come and go, but civil servants are permanent, meaning they never leave. So you find a right civil servant, a director general or a permanent secretary or whatever, figure out the right civil servant for the right ecosystem, and you build an alliance with the ministry, with the bureaucracy. Bureaucracies never die, right? So you find the right bureaucrat, and obviously work bipartisan, find politicians on all sides of the aisle and all that, and then try to work with bureaucrats as much as possible. But he's identified a really significant problem that Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific is still largely political. But you find the right bureaucrat, you should be able to make things work. Yeah, great point, thanks.
You can pay for that sometimes.
Yeah.
Not the way he's thinking, I think.
No, we're being live streamed.
Well, I mean, we have a few minutes left, and I thought maybe it'd be helpful to wrap up with a couple of ending thoughts from each of you. But perhaps on with the such ever-changing landscape, and also the fact that there are so many different jurisdictions, and you have to all deal with because you're dealing with the huge number of countries. How do you think you're going to adapt to that on the basis that the things you've asked for don't come?
You probably need to start in a country where you most feel familiar with, and then try to navigate your way around to the one that is the closest to it, that follows the same regulatory guidance as of what you are looking for. Systems are all based on the same theoretical guideline on GDPR, HIPAA. Everything has very similar underlying factors within. As long as you are adapting to one of them, you're generally quite safe in what you want to do globally. Obviously, you always need to adapt your solution based on which country you are going into, but overall, all of these ecosystems are rather similar from the underlying guidelines that are out there.
Yeah, and I think probably not dissimilar. I think we, as an example, when we first started our build, we chose to sort of peg up, if you like. So not just do the minimum required, but to scan the ecosystem and think, okay, is there something that's commonly required outside this jurisdiction that may well be something we need in the future? And I think principles like privacy by design, some of those methods are sort of probably addressing what you were talking about, Dario, a little bit, right? So I think if you can be familiar with those, start with that at the center of what you're doing as a guiding principle, it should hopefully, obviously there are still big decisions. Sometimes there's a piece that pegs up that's a very big investment, and there you'd have to think more carefully about that. But I think in principle to scan and go for, if you think there's a realistic chance that you might be operating in a market and the requirements are slightly higher, design for that at the outset.
David, can I confirm your question is how do we as entrepreneurs work with a world with multiple standards, ? Is that right?
Well, that's a good angle, actually. I think maybe you could elaborate on that.
Okay, so the question is how do health innovators work in a world with many countries and many different standards? The answer is I don't know.
And then how do you adapt?
Right. Also, I don't know. But maybe I can share some guiding principles. The first more philosophical thought is that data, just to talk about data for a while, data is an asset. We know that it's an asset. But what happens if one day that health data becomes a national security asset, that you will never be allowed to leave the borders of a country, right? You just must put in a server that's physically based in the particular country. And it's very possible that health data is a national security asset, which means that there's just no way around it, right? It's a national political priority. Let me set that aside, right? The two guiding principles that I think of about adaptation is a business model that adopts a lowest common denominator approach, let's say 80% similar across countries and 20% in country differences, whatever the number, 80, 20, 90, 10, whatever the number. The point is lowest common denominator approach, which seems smart. Number two is, like Dario has mentioned, and to double down a little bit on that, is to say, start in a market that you understand and do that well, and build trust, which is what Emma has said. Because without trust, technologies just don't work. And technologies by themselves just don't work because you need the politics, the economics, the psychology to be all aligned before the technology can take root. Example would be the COVID vaccine. Beautiful mRNA science, but anti-vaxxers out there, right? So these are examples of how politics, economics, and human behavior need to be aligned with technology as well. Those are two guiding principles. Thank you, David.
20 minutes on the dot. Well done. I trust you. So thank you very much, Emma, Dario, and SK, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, everyone.